Ethan Blackwood drifted through the halls of Crestwood High like a phantom, his frail form hardly noticeable as students barreled past him, oblivious to his presence. At 16, he barely scraped 5 feet 5 inches, his pallid complexion appearing almost see-through beneath the bright lights, and heavy shadows under his eyes gave him a look of perpetual weariness. His strong Irish brogue made every word sound odd and unfamiliar to his American peers, and his hand-me-down clothes hung loosely on his slender body, instantly marking him as an outsider. It had only been a month since Ethan and his aunt had arrived in this sleepy village in Vermont, escaping a history that no one at Crestwood High could ever comprehend. His aunt worked 2 jobs at the local bakery, barely earning enough to keep them housed in their tiny room above the laundromat. Ethan kept to himself, only spoke when necessary, and tried to disappear into the background of teenage life that felt so foreign to him. But disappearing was impossible when you were the only kid in school who jumped at loud noises, who devoured every meal like it could be his last, and who moved with the cautious, deliberate steps of someone who had learned early that attracting attention meant pain. The first time Brandon Hayes noticed him, Ethan was sitting alone at the edge of the quad, quietly eating his packed lunch while absorbed in a tattered old book. Brandon was everything Ethan wasn't: towering, powerfully built, with the kind of effortless self-assurance that came from never having to worry about food. He was the star quarterback on the football team, and his father owned the biggest construction firm in town. When Brandon decided someone was worthy of his notice, it was seldom a good sign. "Hey, Paddy," Brandon sneered, using the nickname he'd given Ethan on his first day. "You gonna finish that sandwich?" Ethan looked up slowly, his light green eyes meeting Brandon's for just a split second before returning to his book. He slid the sandwich across the table without a word, hoping it would end there. But Brandon wasn't interested in the sandwich. He was interested in the reaction, the way Ethan's back stiffened, the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly. Brandon had always gotten what he wanted, and right now, he wanted entertainment. "What's wrong, Paddy? Lost your voice?" Brandon laughed, and his buddies, Kyle Peterson and Ryan Cook, joined in. Kyle was almost as big as Brandon, with the same mean streak but less creativity. Ryan was smaller, the kind of kid who hung around bullies because it was safer than being their target. Ethan closed his book carefully, slipped it into his worn bag, and started to leave. But Brandon wasn't finished with him yet. "Where you off to, leprechaun? We're just getting acquainted." The way Brandon said leprechaun made it sound like a slur. Other students were starting to pay attention, turning in their seats to watch. Ethan felt the familiar knot in his stomach, the old instincts surfacing. In another life, in another place, he would have already calculated the distance to the exits, identified improvised weapons, evaluated the threat level of each opponent. But this wasn't that place, and he wasn't that person anymore. At least, he was trying not to be. "I have to go to class," Ethan said softly, his accent thick with apprehension. "Have to go to class," Brandon mimicked, dragging out the vowels in an exaggerated Irish accent. "Have to go to class, leprechaun Paddy." The laughter from the surrounding tables was like a physical punch. Ethan's grip tightened on his bag strap, and for a moment his eyes flashed with something icy and dangerous. But he forced himself to turn away, to walk toward the quad exit with deliberate steps. That's when Kyle stuck out his leg. Ethan fell heavily, his bag flying open as he hit the ground. Books scattered across the pavement, and his well-used journal fell open, revealing pages covered in Gaelic script. The laughter was even louder now, and someone started clapping. "Whoops," Kyle said, smirking down at him. "Sorry, Paddy, didn't see you there." Ethan gathered his books in silence, his face burning with shame. As he reached for his journal, Brandon stepped on it, twisting his heel into the pages. "What's this, Paddy?" "Love letters to your sheep." The journal was the only thing Ethan had left from before, filled with his aunt's recipes and tales from their homeland. Seeing it under Brandon's shoe sent a surge of fury through him, so intense it blurred his vision. His fingers twitched, muscle memory trying to take over, but he couldn't. He wouldn't. His aunt had made him promise. "Please," Ethan pleaded, looking up at Brandon, "please give me my journal." The plea seemed to satisfy something in Brandon. He lifted his foot and stepped back, watching as Ethan carefully picked up the damaged journal and clutched it to his chest. "See you around, Paddy," Brandon said, and there was a threat in his voice that chilled Ethan's blood. The pattern was set that day. Brandon and his friends would find Ethan between classes, in the hallways, sometimes even in the restrooms. They would knock his books out of his hands, make fun of his accent, call him Paddy or Leprechaun or Greenhorn. They would ask him if he missed his potato farm, if he knew how to make whiskey, if he was hiding a pot of gold. Ethan endured it all in silence. He would clean up whatever mess they made, pick up whatever they knocked down, and continue on his way without a word of complaint. He never fought back, never raised his voice, never even looked them in the eye for more than a second. The other students watched it happen with the kind of detached curiosity usually reserved for nature documentaries. Some of them felt sorry for the quiet Irish kid, but not enough to get involved. Getting involved meant becoming a target, and everyone knew it was safer to be a bystander than a victim. Ms. Davies, his history teacher, noticed the increasingly frequent cuts on his knuckles, the way he flinched when anyone raised their voice. She called him aside after class one day, her voice soft with concern. "Ethan, is everything okay at home? Are you having a hard time adjusting to the school?" He looked at her with those light old eyes and nodded slowly. "Everything is fine, Ms. Davies. Thank you for asking." She wanted to press further, wanted to help, but there was something in his voice that warned her off. Something that suggested he had learned long ago that adults couldn't always be trusted to protect you. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. Ethan was walking to his locker after the last bell, looking forward to the weekend, to 2 days of blessed solitude. But Brandon and his crew were waiting for him, and they had brought reinforcements. "Hey, Paddy!" Brandon shouted, his voice echoing in the almost empty hallway. "We were just chatting about you." Ethan stopped walking but didn't turn around. He could hear them closing in, could count their footsteps, could smell the mix of cologne and sweat that seemed to follow them everywhere. "We were wondering," Kyle said, moving to block Ethan's path to the exit, "if it's true what they say about Irish and the drink." "Yeah," Ryan chimed in, encouraged by the presence of the older boys. "I heard you guys are like made of whiskey or something. Is that true, Paddy?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He tried to step around Kyle, but the bigger boy moved to block him again. "Come on, Paddy," Brandon said, his voice taking on a dangerous tone. "We're just curious. You never talk to anyone, never tell us about yourself. We're trying to be friendly here. I want to go home," Ethan said quietly. "Home?" Brandon laughed. "You mean back to Ireland? Yeah, we all want that too. But since you're stuck here with us Americans, you might as well answer our questions." The group had grown now, other students drawn by the promise of entertainment. Someone had their phone out, recording. Ethan could see himself as they saw him, small, foreign, helpless. The familiar anger was rising in his chest, but he pushed it down the way his aunt had taught him. "Violence is never the answer, little hawk," she would say, using his childhood nickname. "Violence is what chased us here. Violence is what we left behind." But as Ethan stood there, surrounded by teenagers who saw him as nothing more than a joke, he could feel the little hawk stirring inside him. The part of him that had learned to survive in places where kindness was a weakness and vulnerability meant death. "I heard," Brandon continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hallway, "that your dad was some kind of terrorist. That's why you're here, right? Your family got run out of Ireland." The words hit Ethan like physical blows. His father had been many things, but a terrorist wasn't one of them. He had been a brave man who had tried to protect his community, tried to stand up for what he believed in. That's what had gotten him killed, and what had sent Ethan and his aunt fleeing across the ocean to this small Vermont village. "My father was a good man," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "Sure he was," Brandon sneered. "That's why you're here instead of there, right? That's why you dress like a beggar and your aunt works at that greasy bakery?" The circle of students was growing, and Ethan could hear their whispers, their snickers. He could see some of them filming with their phones, capturing his humiliation for posterity. His hands were shaking now, and he clenched them into fists to hide it. "You know what?" Brandon said, his eyes lighting up with sudden inspiration. "I think it's time we tested that theory about Irish and the drink. What do you guys think?" The agreement was immediate and enthusiastic. Before Ethan could react, strong hands grabbed his arms, and he found himself being dragged toward the back of the school. He didn't struggle. Not yet. He knew that struggling would only make them more excited, more violent. They dragged him to the loading dock behind the cafeteria, where the big industrial refrigerator stood like a metal giant. It was used for storing milk deliveries, big enough to walk into, with a thick door that sealed tight to keep the cold in. "Perfect," Brandon said, pulling out his phone to record. "Let's see just how tough our little Irishman really is." Ethan felt the old familiar calm settling over him as they forced him toward the refrigerator. It was the same calm he had felt in the cells when the guards would come for him in the dead of night. The same calm he had felt when they would throw him into the ice water, into tanks so cold that most men would break within minutes. They didn't know. They couldn't know. To them, he was just a skinny 16-year-old kid who was too scared to fight back. They had no idea that he had spent 2 years in places that made their worst nightmares look like bedtime stories. "Please," he said, and his voice carried just the right note of fear. "Please don't do this." It was what they wanted to hear. Brandon's smirk widened, and he gestured for Kyle and Ryan to open the refrigerator door. The cold air poured out in a visible fog, and Ethan could see the condensation covering the metal shelves inside. "Don't worry, Paddy," Brandon said, positioning his phone to get the best angle. "We'll let you out in a few minutes, just long enough to see if you're as tough as you pretend to be." They shoved him inside, and the heavy door slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. Ethan heard the click of the external latch, heard their laughter echoing through the metal walls, heard Brandon telling everyone to be quiet so they could hear him begging to be let out. Then there was silence. Ethan stood in the darkness, breathing slowly and evenly. The temperature in the refrigerator was maybe 30 degrees, cold enough to be uncomfortable, cold enough to cause shivers and discomfort in a matter of minutes. But Ethan barely felt it. He had been in colder places, much colder. He had spent weeks in flooded tunnels where the water temperature hovered just above freezing, where the walls were slick with slime and every breath felt like inhaling needles. He had learned to control his body temperature, to conserve his energy, to block out the discomfort through mental exercises that most people had never heard of. Outside, he could hear Brandon and his friends waiting, probably expecting him to start banging on the door within minutes, screaming and crying to be released. He could hear other students gathering, drawn by the excitement of seeing the weird Irish kid finally get what he deserved. But Ethan didn't bang on the door. He didn't scream or cry. Instead, he found a comfortable position against the back wall and settled in to wait. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Ethan could hear confused voices outside now, people wondering why he wasn't making any noise. Brandon was getting impatient, his voice carrying clearly through the metal walls. "Why isn't he saying anything?" Kyle asked, and there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Maybe he passed out," Ryan suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "Nobody passes out that fast," Brandon said, but Ethan could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. 30 minutes, 40. The crowd outside was getting restless, and Ethan could hear teachers' voices now, adults who had noticed the gathering and were asking questions. Someone was arguing about whether they should open the door, but Brandon was insisting that they wait just a little longer. At the 45-minute mark, Ethan heard the sound he had been waiting for, the external latch clicking open. Light flooded the refrigerator as the door swung wide, and a dozen faces peered in, expecting to find a shivering, hypothermic teenager begging for mercy. Instead, they found Ethan sitting calmly against the back wall, his breathing steady, his color normal. There was no frost on his clothes, no chattering teeth, no signs of distress at all. He looked up at them with those light green eyes and smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Is that all?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Back home, we call this a mild summer evening." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Brandon stumbled backward, his face going pale. The other students began whispering among themselves, phones appearing to capture this unbelievable moment. Kyle and Ryan looked like they had seen a ghost. Ethan stood slowly, brushing imaginary dust off his clothes. As he walked toward the door, the crowd parted before him like he was carrying some kind of plague, but he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. "Brandon," he said, his voice soft but carrying an authority that made everyone freeze. "You wanted to know about my father, about why we came to America." Brandon couldn't seem to find his voice. He just stood there, staring at Ethan like he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. "My father," Ethan continued, stepping closer, "was a community leader. He spoke out against people who thought they were above the law, people who thought they could hurt others without consequence. The people he spoke out against didn't like that very much." Another step closer. Brandon tried to back away, but there were too many people behind him. "They killed him," Ethan said, his voice still conversational. "But first, they wanted to send a message. So they took his 14-year-old son, that would be me, and they put him in a place where little boys go to disappear. They wanted to break me, to make me a warning of what happens when you defy the powerful." The silence was absolute now. Even the teachers who had arrived to break up the gathering had stopped talking, drawn in by the quiet intensity of Ethan's voice. "For 2 years," Ethan continued, "I lived in places that would haunt your dreams. I learned things that no child should ever have to learn. I survived things that would crush most grown men, and do you know what kept me alive, Brandon?" Brandon shook his head, unable to speak. "The knowledge that someday, somewhere, there would be people like you. People who think that strength comes from picking on those who can't fight back. People who think that power means inflicting pain on others." Ethan was close enough to touch Brandon now, close enough that everyone could see the difference between them. Brandon was taller, stronger, supposedly tougher, but in that moment, he looked like a child compared to the pale, slender boy standing in front of him. "You want to see what I learned in those cells, Brandon?" Ethan asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You want to find out what happens when you push someone who has nothing left to lose?" For a moment, it looked like Brandon might say yes. His pride was battling with his growing fear, and Ethan could see the exact moment when fear won. I'm sorry," Brandon stammered, his voice cracking. It was just a joke, man. We didn't mean anything by it." Ethan studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I know you didn't mean anything by it. That's the problem. You hurt people because you're bored, because it makes you feel important because you can. That's what makes you dangerous, Brandon. Not your size, not your friends, not your father's money. Your indifference to other people's suffering." He turned to address the entire crowd now, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "I came here to make a fresh start, to leave the violence behind. My aunt made me promise to be better than the people who hurt my family. For a month, I've kept that promise. I've let you mock me, humiliate me, hurt me, because I thought that was what being better meant. His light eyes swept across the faces of his classmates, and many of them looked away. But I was wrong. Being better doesn't mean being a doormat. It doesn't mean letting bullies do whatever they want, because fighting back might make you just like them. Sometimes being better means standing up, even when it's terrifying, especially when it's terrifying. Ethan took a step back, giving Brandon some breathing room, but his eyes never left the bigger boy's face. You have a choice to make, Brandon. All of you do. You can keep being the kind of people who hurt others for entertainment, or you can choose to be better. But understand this, I'm done being your punching bag. I'm done being anyone's punching bag. The crowd was starting to break up now, teachers moving in to restore order, students drifting away in small groups, whispering among themselves. But Brandon remained frozen in place, staring at Ethan like he was seeing him for the first time. "What are you?" Brandon whispered. Ethan considered the question carefully. "I'm someone who survived hell so I could have a chance at a peaceful life. I'm someone who lost everything and came here hoping to find something better. I'm someone who's been pushed as far as he can be pushed." He paused, then added, "But mostly, I'm just a 16-year-old kid who wants to be left alone." As Ethan walked away, heading toward the front of the school where his aunt would be waiting to pick him up, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on his back. But it felt different now. Where before there had been dismissal and contempt, now there was something else. Respect, maybe, or fear. He wasn't sure which one he preferred. The following day, Crestwood High School was a different place for Ethan Blackwood. Students who had never spoken to him before nodded when they passed him in the halls. Teachers looked at him with new interest, as if they were seeing him clearly for the first time. And Brandon Hayes, the terror of the junior class, went out of his way to avoid eye contact. The story of what had happened in the refrigerator had spread overnight, growing in the retelling. Some versions had Ethan meditating like a guru. Others had him doing calisthenics in the freezing temperatures. A few claimed he had been humming Irish drinking songs the whole time. Ethan didn't bother to correct any of the stories. Let them believe what they wanted to believe. The important thing was that nobody was calling him Paddy anymore. At lunch, he sat in his usual corner, reading his book and eating his packed lunch. But this time, when someone approached his table, it wasn't Brandon or his crew. It was Olivia Diaz, a quiet girl from his art class who had always seemed as invisible as he had been. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. Ethan looked up, surprised. "Of course, please." As she settled into her seat, she glanced around the cafeteria, noticing the way conversations quieted down whenever people looked in their direction. "So," she said casually, opening her own lunch bag. "Ireland, huh?" Ethan's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. Actually, it was more like Northern Ireland, but close enough. "Northern Ireland," she repeated thoughtfully. "I've heard it's beautiful there." "Parts of it are," Ethan agreed. "The parts that aren't covered in barbed wire and concrete walls." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, two invisible kids who had suddenly become very visible indeed. Finally, Olivia spoke again. "You know, I always thought you seemed haunted," she said. "Not scared, not angry, just haunted." Ethan considered this. "I suppose I was. It's hard to leave everything behind and start over, especially when the things you left behind weren't your choice." "But you're not just haunted, are you?" Olivia continued. "There's something else, something that Brandon and his friends never saw." "What do you think it is?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Olivia took a bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "Resilience, I guess. Not the kind that comes from bravado or arrogance, but the kind that comes from enduring things that would destroy other people. The kind that lets you sit in a refrigerator for almost an hour without shivering." "You think that makes me resilient?" Ethan asked. I think, Olivia said carefully, that you're the most resilient person in this school. Maybe the most resilient person I've ever met. And I think you're also the most alone. The observation struck Ethan harder than he expected. He had been so focused on keeping his head down, on avoiding trouble, that he hadn't realized how isolated he had become. Even before the incident with Brandon, he had been drifting through his days like a shadow, barely connecting with anyone or anything. Perhaps, he admitted, but I'm not sure I know how to be anything else. Maybe you don't have to figure it out all at once, Olivia suggested. Maybe you can start with just being yourself, the real you, not the version you think people want to see. As if summoned by their conversation, Brandon appeared at the edge of their table. But this wasn't the swaggering, confident bully who had tormented Ethan for weeks. This was a different Brandon, one who looked smaller somehow, less sure of himself. Ethan, he said, his voice quiet enough that only they could hear him. Can I talk to you? Ethan looked up at him, noticing the way Brandon's hands trembled slightly, the way he kept glancing around as if afraid someone might be watching. Of course, Ethan said, gesturing to an empty chair. Brandon sat down carefully, like he was expecting the chair to collapse under him. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Brandon cleared his throat. I want to apologize, he said, the words coming out in a rush. Not just for yesterday, but for everything. The taunts, the shoves, all of it. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Ethan studied Brandon's face, looking for signs of deception or insincerity. But all he saw was a 17-year-old boy who looked as lost and confused as Ethan felt most days. Why? Ethan asked simply. Why what? Why did you do it? Why did you decide I was worth tormenting? Brandon looked down at his hands, struggling to find the words. I don't know. Because I could, I guess. Because you were different, and different was easy to pick on. Because it made me feel powerful. And now? Now I can't stop thinking about what you said, about your father, about the cells, about what kind of person I am. Brandon looked up, meeting Ethan's eyes. I don't want to be that person anymore. Ethan nodded slowly. That's a start. I know an apology doesn't undo anything, Brandon continued. I know I can't take back what I did, but I want to try to make it right somehow. How? Brandon was quiet for a moment, then straightened up with visible effort. I want to tell everyone the truth. About what really happened yesterday, about what I did to you, about what kind of person you really are. And what kind of person am I? Ethan asked, genuinely curious. Someone who's been through hell and came out the other side without losing his humanity, Brandon said. Someone who could have destroyed me yesterday but chose not to. Someone who's stronger than all of us put together but doesn't use that strength to hurt people. The sincerity in Brandon's voice was unmistakable, and Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly. That would take time. But the beginning of understanding. I accept your apology, Ethan said finally, but understand that it will take time for trust to develop between us. I understand, Brandon said, relief evident in his voice. Thank you. For not doing to me what I deserved. As Brandon stood to leave, he paused and looked back at Ethan. For what it's worth, he said, I'm glad you're here. I think this place needs someone like you. After he was gone, Olivia looked at Ethan with newfound respect. That was remarkable, she said. Most people in your position would have wanted revenge. Revenge is tempting, Ethan replied, thinking of his aunt's words. Forgiveness is harder, but building something better is hardest of all. The weeks that followed brought changes that Ethan hadn't anticipated. Brandon, true to his word, began actively working to undo the damage he had done. He stopped his friends from harassing other students, stood up to bullies in the hallways, and even started volunteering with the student support program. Kyle and Ryan, deprived of their leader's encouragement, found their taste for bullying had diminished considerably. They kept their distance from Ethan, but they also stopped targeting other vulnerable students. As for Ethan himself, he found that standing up for himself had opened doors he hadn't known existed. Students who had ignored him before began including him in conversations, inviting him to study sessions, asking for his help with subjects he excelled in. He discovered that Olivia wasn't the only one who had been watching him from the sidelines. There were other quiet students, other outsiders who had recognized something in him long before the incident in the refrigerator. They formed a small group of friends who met in the library during lunch, discussing books and art, and the kinds of big questions that most teenagers avoided. Ms. Davies, his history teacher, called him aside after class one day with an opportunity that surprised him. "Ethan," she said, "I've been thinking about what happened a few weeks ago, and I have a suggestion for you." "Yes, ma'am." "I run a workshop for new immigrant students, kids who are struggling to adjust to American culture. I think you could be a real inspiration to them. Your experiences, your perspective could help other students who are going through similar challenges." Ethan considered this carefully. "What would I have to do?" "Just talk to them. Share your story, if you're comfortable doing that. Show them that it's possible to overcome difficult circumstances and still achieve something meaningful." The idea was both daunting and appealing. Ethan had spent so long hiding from his past, trying to pretend it didn't exist, that the thought of deliberately sharing it felt like stepping out into the unknown. But maybe that was exactly what he needed to do. "I'll think about it," he told Ms. Davies. That evening, as he walked home from school, Ethan found himself taking a different path through the town square. The late autumn air was chilly, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the commotion ahead of him. A group of older guys, maybe in their early 20s, had cornered a younger kid against the wall of the general store. Ethan could hear their taunts, could see the fear in the younger boy's eyes, and felt the familiar clenching in his chest. For a moment, he hesitated. This wasn't his problem. He had done his part, had stood up for himself, had earned his place at school. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't seen anything, continue on his path toward a normal life. But as he watched the older guys closing in on their victim, he heard his aunt's voice in his head, not warning him away from violence this time, but reminding him of something else she had taught him. The hawk protects the vulnerable little one. That is what makes him more than just another predator. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the twilight. "Leave him alone." The older guys turned toward him, sizing him up. They saw what everyone saw, a slight, pale teenager who looked like he could be blown over by a strong wind. "Mind your own business, kid," the largest one said, turning back to his victim. "This is my business," Ethan replied, moving closer. "Let him go." Something in his voice made them pause. It was the same quality that had frozen Brandon and his friends in place, the sound of someone who had nothing left to lose. "You want to take his place?" one of them sneered, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Ethan smiled, and it was the same chilling smile he had worn in the refrigerator. "If that's what it takes." The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only moments. Then, without quite understanding why, the older guys began backing away. They muttered threats and curses, but their hearts weren't in it anymore. Something about the pale, quiet teenager had unnerved them in a way they couldn't explain. After they were gone, Ethan helped the younger boy to his feet. The kid couldn't have been more than 13, with the kind of frightened, desperate look that Ethan recognized all too well. "Thank you," the boy whispered. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. Liam O'Connell." "Well, Liam O'Connell, Let me tell you something about bullies. They're like wolves, but not the noble kind. They hunt in packs, they prey on the weak, and they scatter when someone stands up to them. Liam nodded, still trembling slightly. But here's the thing, Ethan continued. You don't have to be a target. You don't have to let them define who you are. You can choose to be stronger than they are, not by fighting, but by refusing to let them break your spirit. As Ethan walked away, leaving Liam standing in the fading light, he realized that Ms. Davies had been right. His experiences, terrible as they were, had given him something invaluable: the ability to recognize suffering in others and the knowledge of how to survive it. Maybe it was time to stop running from his past and start using it to build a better future. The next day, he found Ms. Davies after class and told her he was ready to join the new immigrant student workshop. It was time to stop being the victim of his story and start becoming a guide for someone else's. Standing in the hallway of Crestwood High School, surrounded by the everyday chaos of teenage life, Ethan Blackwood finally understood what his aunt had been trying to teach him all along. Strength wasn't about enduring suffering in silence. It wasn't about hiding from your past or pretending to be someone you weren't. Real strength was about taking the worst things that had happened to you and using them to make sure they didn't happen to someone else. It was about standing up, not just for yourself, but for everyone who couldn't stand up for themselves. He was no longer the ghost in the hallway, the invisible boy that everyone ignored. He wasn't Paddy the victim, or the mysterious Irishman with the dark past. He was Ethan Blackwood, survivor and guardian, ready to face whatever came next with the kind of courage that could only come from having already survived the worst and chosen to remain compassionate despite it all. Characters: original length, Beggy 33002, transformed length, Yigi 33137,